Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our session today. My name is Sergio, and I work as a product marketing manager here at Logpoint. And today I will be your host for this webinar on our latest release for Logpoint's Converged SIEM platform. We are going to deep dive into all the improvements and benefits this quarterly release comes with. And to help me explain the ins and outs of all the work we put into this release, I count with two of my colleagues who are not only experts in Logpoint, but also in everything cybersecurity. Here with me, I have Eddie Almer, our senior product manager, and Niels Kramry, our senior pre-sales engineer. So before we start, let me tell you some practicalities. This session is recorded. If you haven't noticed, there is this little mention on the top of your screen. And let's move into the agenda. So we're going to give you a little introduction to the Q1 release. And then we are going to move into some updates that will benefit our MSSPs. And we will go through what is new in this Q1 release. As well, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. But if you have any urgent question along the way, or you feel it's important to share it right now, please feel free to add them in the chat, and we will go through them during our Q&A at the end, as I aforementioned. And finally, let me mention that we are going to talk about Agent X, our native endpoint agent. But if you're interested in knowing more about Agent X, I strongly recommend you to attend our webinar on the 2nd of May. And now, without further ado, let's talk about this new quarterly release for the whole Converged platform. And I will hand it over to you, Eddie and Niels. So let's get started.
Thank you, Sergio. So as usual, we're going to have quite a focus on the MSSP side of things. MSSPs are an important part of our customer base, our partner base, and helping you, our end customers, achieve your goals. In order to make it easy for everybody, we've grouped here together information about a number of releases, about the Logpoint 7.2 SIEM release, about the SOAR 1.3 release, the Director 2.2 release, the UEBA backend update. The version number is 1.6, but because UEBA is in the cloud, it doesn't really matter in itself for you. And our initial launch of Agent X, our endpoint security agent. We're going to talk about each and every one of them in this session. When it comes to MSSP, there is a lot of focus on allowing things to be managed across the board for multiple tenants from a single location. So we made it possible to manage SOAR through Director. We made it easier to distribute additional types of content through Director. And we're going to show you today, we have a new case management and new integrations for SOAR that would make it easier for everybody to, first of all, manage your cases instead of individual incidents, and then a lot of integrations that would make it easy to automate all kinds of processes. Agent X that you're going to see today, I'm sure some of you already had a chance to get a taste, but this is the official release, and this is great for forensic collection and for incident response across tenants, and of course, on your own network if you're managing your own instance. One more improvement that is specific to large organizations and multi-tenant organizations is better UEBA detectors, and we'll be talking about those as well. So Niels, take us through Agent X.
Yes, thank you, Eddie. If you move to the next slide. For those of you that have been with Logpoint for a while, you will know that we have had essentially two iterations of an agent. We used to have an Xlog, which is still available to customers, and we used to have the Logpoint agent for Windows, which is also still available to customers. Agent X is the evolution of that agent, and it will eventually perhaps replace the existing agents, but there's no immediate need to do it. For those of you who want to try Agent X, there is a migration function that you can use to make that easy. And why would you want to use it? Well, you can see it in that little diagram at the top. It rounds off the kind of converged SIEM platform that we're offering, which consists of more than just SIEM. It's SIEM, it's UBA, and it's SOAR. SOAR being able to drive playbooks and drive actions, and that is precisely one of the areas where Agent X can integrate, so that you can not only use Agent X to give you responses to questions you might ask from a client, but it can also take some active remediation actions. As always, we make the most of the community that's out there. So we are using some open source components in Agent X, but they are bundled in nice user-friendly ways that work with Logpoint, just like the old Logpoint agent did, and that should make it much easier to use than if you use open source on its own. It ships with a lot of pre-built material, like always, including new dashboards and response playbooks in SOAR as well. What's different about Agent X? There's quite a few differences, even in the way that the agent works. So firstly, through the use of those open source components, there are certain things that the agent can now detect on the endpoints on its own. That doesn't sound like much, but if you think about how the agent used to work, it would be just forwarding logs, and it would be up to the SIEM to interpret them and then maybe tell you about them. With Agent X, there are certain things that the agent does on its own on the endpoint, and it might be detecting certain things on the endpoint. It then supplies this detection together with compliance and MITRE tagging in the log already to Logpoint, in addition to being able to do all the things that an agent does, which is forwarding just the raw logs. It can also use OS query. For those of you who don't know it, it's a kind of a standard way of querying operating system information that works across different operating systems. And you can see in the screenshot, it allows us to do certain things that are useful. Things like getting information about the installed software, for example, or even just the Windows version, where we used to hope that something like that arises in a log. Now we can use this to actively gather that information. And obviously, using the response playbooks to carry out actions on the endpoint, such as perhaps isolating an endpoint. Next slide, please. Behind the scenes, Agent X works a bit differently to the previous agent. The Logpoint agent used to rely on two-way communication, which made it more difficult to deploy, where you would have to have the Logpoint server allowed to talk to the endpoint and the endpoint allowed to talk to Logpoint. Now the communication is only in one direction. It's the endpoint querying the Logpoint environment. That includes the response actions, where it periodically pulls information from the server to see whether there's any actions that it needs to carry out. We've also made some improvements to the support of host names and dynamic host names, and there's more to come in that space. And it sets us up for support for a broader set of platforms. The Windows release is out, as well as support for Debian Linux. The next release will bring in Red Hat and SLES, and also Mac OS, which has been a common request. And because of the functionality of the agent now, it makes sense potentially to have these agents on those platforms. They used to be very Windows driven, because that's where a lot of the intelligence was. But on Linux and Mac OS, we can now also run things like OS query, which is useful. And it forms the foundation of future functionality that we can now do with Agent X. In terms of architecture, as I said, you can see the communication is all in one direction. It's the agent, it's the endpoint initiating it. It does a few things like log collection, the sysmon logs that you might be collecting, things like inventory actions and compliance scans that get delivered to an Agent X manager component that runs in Logpoint. That can actually be on multiple Logpoints. If your network infrastructure requires that, you could have these Agent X managers in multiple locations, and then obviously that data feeds into the SIEM and might in return lead to response actions.
Okay, and following Agent X, we'll talk about Director. Director is the tool that we're using to manage a multiple tenant deployment, where we do two main things with Director. One, we manage the overall configuration of multiple tenants, and we also get results from multiple tenants. So we're constantly adding to the Director in terms of operational capabilities, like the disk usage widget, like login captchas, like detailed audit logs. We have the ability to select multiple objects for deployment, one of the big improvements in this version. And in the version that was released right before this one for SOAR, we also enable configuration of SOAR on multiple tenants from the Director. On the right-hand side, you can also see that now we have results for different UEBA tenants possible within Director. And with this, back to you, Niels.
Now, there is obviously, as part of this wider spring release, an update to the SIEM version. And you will notice a few visible changes and also some not so visible ones. The first visible change is that we've introduced a new type of dashboard, which you can see a screenshot of here. These dashboards can operate differently to how the previous dashboards operate, which are all still available. They were all based on queries. These dashboards could be other things. You can see two examples to start with. The system health is very similar to the system monitor. The SOC operation, though, is something that we didn't have previously. That gives you an overview of both the incidents as well as the case status. So it's essentially an enabler for more types of dashboards in the future. Next slide, please. Then there is a new log source onboarding flow. At the moment, you can see one example here. It only covers the universal REST fetcher. Largely because that is probably the one that needed it the most. You might remember we introduced the universal REST fetcher recently. Depending on the log source that you're trying to bring in, there are an awful lot of configuration parameters to set, such as in this example, the base URL, the authentication mechanism, and so on. And we've taken that opportunity to include a new way of onboarding a log source, where we can supply templates that will ship out of the box and can be updated. And you can see how that takes you along all the requirements to set up a log source. So where the workflow was very much previously to set up a repository and then set up a routing policy and a normalization policy, in this case, you can do it all from one screen. For example, if you don't have the right repository, you can create it right from here and it takes you by the hand. So that will expand onto other log source types, but for now, it is for the universal REST API sources. Next slide, please. When you onboard a log source like that, and it's has been updated, you can see it here that you get a nice little overview of the number of logs you have received from this log source. That is a common request. I want to see how many logs I'm receiving per device type. We could service that previously by running queries and dashboards and alert rules and so on, but here it's now nicely integrated into the product. You can see it immediately for the log sources that you have configured. Along with that, if you're not using log sources that are using this new onboarding mechanism, you will still notice a new column in your device list. That is another very common request where people want to make sure that they are receiving up-to-date logs from all their log sources. Again, there are alert rules and dashboards that we can have for that, but with this, there's no need to configure anything. You'll see it immediately, and you could see, for example, this top device, we never received any logs, whereas all the bottom ones are within the last 30 seconds or so. So that's a useful little indicator. Next slide, please. And there's a few things that happen behind the scenes. One functionally very important one, but only to certain people, is that we're now able to handle logs that are arriving with a delay. That has always been an issue when we can't rely on timely log sources. And that's not necessarily because of delays within Logpoint, but mostly with cloud services that have certain SLAs for when they might be raising their alerts or their log messages. So we can now essentially hold back the alerts until we are certain that all the considered logs have arrived, and that can be configured on a per alert rule basis. So for example, if you're doing this for Office 365 logs, you could enable that for all your Office 365 alerts and set it to a threshold where you can be confident that all the logs that you might want to consider for that alert are covered. And then lastly, I've mentioned it with Agent X. It is now under certain circumstances possible to add a device by host name rather than IP address. This relies on DNS lookups. So Logpoint needs to be able to resolve that host name to the IP that it actually is.
Okay, and we also have a new SOAR release. The SOAR release is mainly about a brand new case management, and I'm going to show you a bit of that in a moment. There's a new timeline interface, the possibility to attach artifacts of various types, a new run playbook interface that is very convenient, notifications between different users in SOAR, and assigning the case to a certain user from SOAR, status updates, of course, and the ability to interact with playbooks that require interaction and link to them directly from the case. Also, in the coming version that will be released next week, very, very soon, there is a new case API that allows our playbooks to select cases and attach incidents. This is important because now, instead of looking at individual incidents, sometimes getting quite a long list of those incidents, you can look at a case, and that case can contain multiple related incidents, making it very easy to assign the related incidents to the same analyst and allow that analyst to handle them in one go as part of an attack, rather than forcing them to switch between multiple incidents that they somehow made sense that they are connected. There's also additional features in the SOAR release. We have the ability to backup and restore all playbooks and all actions. This is a first step towards allowing you to automatically distribute content or automatically consume content from Logpoint. So if you as an MSSP are planning to write playbooks for customers, you'll be able to distribute them. If you want to get all the new playbooks that our security research team is writing for responding to all those new attacks, you'll be able to consume them automatically based on this capability. We've also made it much easier to select the trigger for various playbooks. And as usual, we added new integrations. So new playbooks, new categories, new actions, new vendors. One of those you may have seen in the past is the one with ChatGPT, allowing you to basically summarize cases, summarize incidents, and ask for textual advice from ChatGPT and incorporate it automatically into the case. So let's switch for a moment into the actual case management. So you can see here a nice queue for SOC user. You can sort by severity. You can sort by status. All we have here is in progress. You can sort by certain tags, and you can filter things. So we can look only at in progress stuff, everything here. If we try to look at closed, all of a sudden we have none because everything we have here is in progress. Let's look at one of those cases, see how easy it is to now understand. From the timeline, you can filter specific things. For example, when were artifacts added? When was the case changed? Were any comments added? So let's look only at comments. There was one comment. You can easily go and look for it. And you can also look at artifacts that were added. So it could be a host name, it could be a username, it could be a domain. And for each of those, you can very easily run playbooks that are specific to, for example, the username. So we can run here, find an active user and run the playbook. And you can see, once we remove the filtering, that the playbook has been added to the timeline. Let's remove the comment. And we launch the 85 inactive user from case. So it makes it much easier for your analysts to look at a case end to end and to have multiple incidents in it, making it much, much easier to actually handle a large volume of incidents that are grouped together into cases. So now, back to the additional software. So one more thing we did, we released a new version of UEBA. In UEBA, we have a very important detector that allows you to connect your cloud customers. Cloud customers, nowadays, with all of us working at least partially from home, is pretty much everybody in your organization. We're seeing quite a few organizations that are connecting their on-premises customers, users through AD, but their cloud customers are connected to Office 365 or to Gmail and or Azure. And those new detectors that we did in this version are allowing you to group together both the on-prem and the cloud and find anomalies that are a lot more relevant and a lot more accurate as a result of looking at each user in its own context. With that, I can see that there's already quite a number of questions that you have. We have quite a bit of time for questions. So let's start looking at what you're asking.
Yeah, someone asked, is an integration from Google Security Center possible to forward the logs from there to the Logpoint?
So absolutely, yes. One possibility is to forward the logs if Google allows it. And not only that, some providers, XDR providers, may make it difficult for you to forward all the raw logs. We are allowing you not only to forward all the logs, if that is possible, that's easy to do with Logpoint, but even if some of your log sources cannot be easily forwarded, you can integrate them with SOAR, and SOAR can query back with pointed questions into them and retrieve only the needed data pretty much automatically. So if you want to connect Google, just reach out to us and we'll be happy to connect it for you.
I think I can answer a bit more on that. We have, and you might not be aware, we have released a Google Cloud Platform fetcher not too long ago, and that can be used to subscribe to pub/sub topics. As far as I understand, Google Security Center would be writing to a topic, so it should be possible to do it that way.
Great. Also, what operating systems are supported by Agent X?
So we kind of covered that. We already have today Windows and the first Linux available, and we will have additional Linux flavors and Mac OS in the next version. Keep in mind that we're based on open source capabilities. So if there is any OS that you would really want us to support and you're open to being an early adopter, we're not writing the agents themselves from scratch. So it's very quick for us to get them up and running. Our getting them up and running is a lot more about the content and the integration level, the playbooks that we're writing for them. So if you have any specific OS that you're interested in, we're happy to support it and support it quickly.
As well, is the update of playbooks in SOAR automatic?
So the update that I was talking about today is still done by uploading a file or distributing a file through Director. In the next version, it will be fully automated if you configure it that way. So you'll be able to configure your Logpoint if it's connected to the internet or connected to the server of your MSSP provider to actually pull new playbook content automatically. Next version, not this one.
Someone also asked if there are plans for iPhone, iPad, or any operating system at Edge LTE.
So agent-wise, probably not. We can receive logs from various mobile device managers across that are managing a set of those devices. But right now, there isn't a specific plan to put an agent on an iPhone or an Android device for that matter. If you would like to discuss it further with us, we can obviously help you out if the volume is right.
And as well, regarding director permissions and in conformity to EAL3+, is looking at more than one client at a time in an admin role authorized by the 4I principle per client, SLA, or GDPR checklist.
So this is something we need to check in terms of 4I authorizations. We'll take it offline and get back to, I can see who the person asking this is.
In addition to it, in Logpoint 7.2, a new feature introduced in the device view is a column to view last log received from a device. This information is stored in a Redis database and cannot be queried from the UI, and by that, you can use that for alerts. Are there any plans to allow this information to be queried from the web UI for reports or alerts without having to perform much heavier queries in the actual log data from devices to get the same information?
And the answer is absolutely yes. The reason is that we're going to use that data ourselves in our machine learning algorithms, so we can quickly and easily detect that something is not running as quickly as possible. Even if there's only a drop in the frequency of last log change, we're going to detect that and we're going to use that. Now, there isn't a date yet for this feature. However, in order to do that feature, we're going to enable exactly the capability that you just described in terms of, is this data about last log received going to be available to building dashboards, to doing quick queries, to basically processing. We'd recommend that you just use what we're building, but if you want to go beyond that, you're of course welcome.
Also, someone else asked about Agent X and Director, and they were asking whether it's a full solution and it can deploy tool as needed only.
So maybe there's more than one question here. So first of all, Agent X on Director. Agent X is managed individually by the individual tenants, right? We don't have an Agent X server that is managing multiple tenants. Rather, we have a server per tenant, and this can be distributed, installed in the various tenants, and you can have an Agent X deployments for each and every one of them. one. The second half of the question, Sergio? Sorry.
So the second part was, well, we said it was a full solution, and the second part, if it can be deployed, can deploy tool as needed only. Perhaps the question, if you feel like, yeah.
So you can choose to enable Agent X, deploy Agent X only to specific tenants, if that was the question.
Alternatively, if that person needs more info, also please.
Then we'll be happy to reach out.
Currently, SOAR is updated in Logpoint. Currently, when SOAR is updated in Logpoint, all containers for SOAR needs to be started for it to be upgraded, which also consumes a lot of RAM on the host. Are there any plans to detach this from patches so you don't have to deal with SOAR on systems that never have this running?
Okay, so this is part of a wider question, which is the overall minimum requirements for SOAR and for SOAR installation. We know that this is a touchy point for some of you that have lower spec machines, especially for small customers. And yes, it is one of the things that we are considering as part of planned improvements to the size and the efficiency and the stability of the installation of the combined SIEM and SOAR.
Someone else asked, API native bound for clouds, Office 365 UAVA, or extract logs in direct from buckets. So perhaps if that person wants to provide a bit more of information to that question, or unless you, Eddie or Niels, consider it's clear enough.
I can interpret it. So especially for Office 365, we're using the Office 365 Management API to pull in the logs. So in that world of Office 365, there aren't really any buckets that we can pull data from. Now on AWS, there are some fetches that are indeed working by pulling data from buckets. It kind of depends on what the service is, CloudWatch, CloudTrail, VPC, Flow Logs, and so on. So sometimes we use the APIs, sometimes we use an S3 API to fetch files from buckets. All of that is independent of UBA. UBA works on the data that is held within the SIEM, no matter how it got there. That is then independent, no matter how the log data was fetched.
As well, someone asked about whether Logpoint can now deal with the NHS Office 365 tenant and separate trust.
That is something that I was involved in. It's a very specific question. There hasn't been much progress on that front due to multiple parties being involved. We'll leave it at that.
And as well, in the latest version of Logpoint, add new button named Log Sources. What functionalities does this new option provide?
So that is something that I've covered, I hope. That is a different way of onboarding log sources that at the moment is for universal REST fetcher sources, so mostly cloud sources. We're still building templates for that, so you won't see much in there at the moment, but that will become the way to onboard log sources. You can think of it as a wizard, even though it's not, but it's that kind of idea behind it.
And if I'll iterate again, what does it provide? It saves you probably 90% of the time you would have spent otherwise configuring new log sources. I know many of you here on the call have already had a chance to do things the old way, basically configure all the needed infrastructure and only then start connecting a log source. And if you didn't prepare everything, then you get stuck in the middle, go back somewhere else completely in the GUI, reconfigure it, and then go back to where you were and try to get it working without an immediate indication that things are connected. So things used to be not as great. They're much, much better. And I'm sure we can improve even further.
Also, I can see that there was one question I marked as answer. It was about licensing types, about Agent X and Director. I don't know if anyone of you want to take it, or I can answer it myself.
You might have one yourself, Sergio.
Perfect. Well, Agent X is a feature that is available for everyone with a with a SIEM SOAR license. For Director is also the same principle. Is our pricing is based on the number of nodes, not on data volume. And also for enterprise, I mean, we offer licensing agreements for very large customers as well. So I think that also answers that question. Someone else asked about, could you describe different modes of
Agent X.
Yeah, of Agent X deployments? As I can see, there are two deployment scenarios.
Right. So probably the most common deployment we'll be supporting would be allowing a download of a prepackaged agent and installation. That installation can run automatically. So if you have a deployment system in Windows, you can use it. But there isn't deployment infrastructure built into Logpoint. Logpoint would allow the agents to connect, would manage them, would help you build the package and configure it, but there isn't a deployment system per se.
It seems there are no more questions in the Q&A either, or actually there's one. Well, it's just a congratulations.
So thank you everybody for spending the time with us, and thank you for your many interesting questions. I hope you find this version useful, and we were talking about the 7.2 release. Today, 7.2.1 is coming out. So if you were waiting to see that the early adopters have played with it, so be assured they have, and you can go ahead.
Also, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And also, please remember that if you're interested in knowing more about Agent X, there is a webinar on the 2nd of May. We will answer in all the questions and try to go through the ins and outs on Agent X. So having said that, I wish you all a good afternoon.
And for those of you in the US, a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.